Hi, my name is Jason Angel, and I'm a police officer in the Tulsa, Oklahoma area. I'm making this video to address the case of Daniel Holtzclaw, a former Oklahoma City police officer whose arrest and conviction made national headlines in 2015. Since that time, many people have come forward questioning whether or not Daniel was really guilty of the things he was accused of doing, or was he rather the victim of an incompetent and biased investigation, political cowardice, and corruption. At first glance, I thought Daniel was guilty and an embarrassment to law enforcement. His story of using his badge to sexually assault women made me sick. His 263-year sentence didn't bother me because his crimes were so terrible. What made this worse was that this was during a time when many in media, celebrities, and politicians were bashing cops left and right, and cities like Ferguson and Baltimore were being destroyed by rioters, angry at the police. In most cases around the country, the facts didn't matter to the media or protesters, but the pressure for changes to be made caused some politicians and district attorneys to crumble under pressure and rush to charge officers with crimes. Like many officers, the national anti-police narrative wore on me. It wore especially heavily when an officer in northeastern Oklahoma was charged by a prosecutor trying to avoid what was happening in Ferguson, Charlotte, and elsewhere. Thankfully, the officer was cleared, but I saw how the prosecution lied to the jury, misrepresented police tactics and training to make the officer look bad, and tried to blame the police, the very people he relies on to testify against the people he prosecutes daily, and say they covered for the officer. Against that backdrop, I came across a video on YouTube by Michelle Malkin called Daniel in the Den. It was a documentary about Daniel Holtzclaw, and I realized I wasn't very familiar with the case. However, I assumed he was guilty and thought I would watch and debunk the claims in the video, as I assumed Michelle was just playing team politics with a police issue like many in the media were. But as I watched the video and then checked her claims against other sources, I couldn't believe Daniel was charged with a crime, let alone convicted. I'm now convinced he was the victim of an incompetent investigation and cowardly politicians fearing mob violence. Links to Michelle Malkin's video will be in the description below, as well as to other sources. Some of the biggest obstacles people have to overcome when looking at this case are the widespread myths that were spread through the media. The first is that 13 victims accused Daniel Holtzclaw of sexual assaults. In reality, only one initially accused Daniel, then a biased and incompetent investigation provided 12 more accusers. Before Daniel was ever accused, a woman named Terry Morris, a drug addict with schizophrenia, claimed a police officer forced her to perform oral sex. The detectives did not have information to go on for the case, but a few weeks later, Janie Liggins accused Daniel Holtzclaw of forcing her to perform oral sex on him during a traffic stop, early one morning in June 2014. Detectives heard Janie's story and thought that the two women may have been sexually assaulted by the same officer. I'll talk about the bias that led them to assume this later, but I'll just say that the assumption led them to seek out additional accusers in a bizarre and unethical manner. Soon Daniel's face was in the media, and months later another accuser came forward, Shardarian Hill. She claimed Holtzclaw raped her while handcuffed to a hospital bed in a busy emergency room. As if her story was not unbelievable enough, she was proven to be a liar in court when she was caught on video at the end of an interview talking to a lead detective saying, "So is this good evidence? Because he didn't even rape nobody or nothing. He's been in contact with people that he's arrested." So where did the other 10 come from? Detectives, believing Terry Morris and Janie Liggins were assaulted by Holtzclaw, thought that there could be more victims and went back several months through the records checks Daniel performed while in the course of his duties. As Detective Kim Davis, the lead detective in the case, said on 2020, "We just made a list of black females that he stopped and ran and started going door to door." In other words, the narrative that Daniel attacked black females was created when the detectives themselves specifically targeted black women. They didn't even look at white, Hispanic, or any other women. The detectives contacted the women door to door, as Detective Davis said, saying things like, "We have an anonymous tip you were sexually assaulted by a police officer," telling the women that the officer had lots of victims and he was a real bad guy. Well, of the dozens of women they contacted, 10 were willing to say they were victims. I say willing because at least one denied she was a victim 7 times, until Detective Rocky Gregory told her that he was looking for a bad officer with lots of victims. Then she suddenly became one. Other victims said the officer who committed sexual crimes against them was black, Mexican, or other descriptors that were obviously not Daniel Holtzclaw. Their claims varied, and the detectives never showed them a photo lineup, a standard tool in investigations in which a victim or witness is shown a series of photos, one of which investigators believe to be the suspect, in order to see if the victim or witness can identify their attacker. Only one victim, Terry Morris, was shown a photo lineup, and she did not pick Daniel out of that lineup. And the district attorney's office, as we're now learning, pressured the investigators not to show photo lineups to the victims, as they were afraid that Daniel would not be picked out of a lineup again. So there was only one person who accused Daniel, and even though she received a sexual assault exam within 7 hours of her alleged incident, there was no evidence to support her claim of oral sodomy or any other claim she made about Daniel. This explains why detectives and prosecutors needed so many accusers, because as one juror told 2020, the fact that there were so many victims saying that what they were saying resonated with me, that I don't think they're making this stuff up. Like Detective Davis told Michelle Malkin, when you have one victim, I believed her, but we don't always get things done when you have one victim. But when you have 13 and when the MO is the same and the verbiage is the same, it just becomes a little more believable. The MO was not the same or the verbiage, but it does make her feel better charging Daniel when she had so many victims confirming her suspicions. Many people refuse to believe that Daniel can be innocent when he has so many accusers. But what if they knew he had only one, and then the most biased way imaginable to come up with more victims occurred? Another colossal myth is that there was DNA evidence to support claims against Daniel Holtzclaw. As I said earlier, within 7 hours of the alleged sexual assault of Janie Liggins, a SANE test was conducted and no DNA of Daniel's was found on Janie Liggins. DNA was recovered from the fly of Daniel's pants, and it's important to note that that was the only area that was tested. A skin cell on Daniel's fly was found to have come from Adara Gardner, who was a teenager at the time. When she was found to have had DNA on Daniel's pants, the detectives went to her and asked her what happened to her. This was months after Daniel had his face all over the news. She spun the wild tale that Daniel raped her for several minutes on her front porch on a summer evening, which for those who work in the neighborhoods like those Adara lived in, know are full of activity, especially since it is light out so late. Yet, there were no signs of vaginal fluid, semen, or other indicators of sexual assault on Daniel's uniform pants. Supposedly, Daniel committed 2 other assaults that shift, to include the assault of Janie Liggins, but there were no indicators of sexual activity from those alleged victims that came after. Also, there was male DNA that did not belong to Daniel on the fly of his pants, and there is no reason to believe he was sexually assaulting males either. All this adds up to is what's likely called transfer DNA. The detectives, who were creating a story, did not consider this possibility. The assistant district attorney prosecuting the case did not either, and told a flat-out lie to the jury that it was a fact that the skin cell from Adara came from the walls of her vagina and vaginal fluid to Daniel's pants, though there is no test to show where the skin cell came from, and there was no vaginal fluid found on Daniel's pants. 6 world-renowned DNA scientists weighed in on Daniel's case and pointed out the lab analyst failed in her analysis and testimony in court, and that the DNA evidence was grossly misrepresented. They pointed out how other areas of Daniel's clothing were not tested to see if DNA was found there as well. For example, Daniel said he did a pat search of Adara and the male she was with. During that contact with them, DNA from them could have easily transferred to Daniel's hands, which he could have then transferred to his pants when using the bathroom or getting undressed. Had his pockets been tested, pins, or buttons on his shirt, it could have showed where DNA transferred from Daniel's hands innocently. I'll let the DNA experts explain this better, and I will link below to sources related to the DNA analysis. But here is an interesting case. In 2013, the American Bar Association Journal reported of a man who is believed to have committed a homicide because his DNA was found on the fingernails of the murder victim. But the man could not have committed the crime because he was in the hospital unconscious when the murder occurred. How did the DNA get there? Well, the same paramedics who took the suspect to the hospital also responded hours later to the homicide. Simply, they transferred the DNA from the suspect to the scene of the crime. As DNA technology becomes more sensitive, the more trace amounts of DNA are recovered. Over the past decade, there have been many discoveries of how easy it is to innocently transfer DNA. In Daniel's case, this was not considered. But since there was no other evidence or witnesses to support the claims of the alleged victims, the skin cell on Daniel's fly was what the detectives and prosecutors, desperate for a conviction, put their full weight behind, never considering they could be wrong. The last myth I'll cover has to do with GPS data supporting the claims of the victims, as was pushed in court. First off, the GPS should match each incident because Daniel ran records checks and gave his location over the radio. That's how the detectives determined to contact these women in the first place. The fact that many of the women's stories didn't match the GPS data is surprising. GPS can tell you where you are with some degree of accuracy, but it can't tell you what you're doing. If GPS data was used, like in Daniel's case, for every accusation, then we have a lot more people going to jail. She said you threatened to kill her, and the GPS on your phone said you were in the house together. Well, we lived together, and I was asleep in my room. Well, the GPS says you were there, so guilty. The bias and incompetence to say that Daniel is guilty because he was where he says he was, with whom he says he was, is idiotic. Also, why would Daniel create a record of those he assaulted? A lot of adult novelty stores get robbed because there is cash available because very few people want their credit card statement to say they were at the sex toy store. Similarly, why would Daniel put himself at the scene of the crime over and over again? But these are the same detectives who believe Daniel raped people on the front porch in summertime or in busy emergency rooms or at busy intersections, etc. The accuracy of the claim was not important as long as someone was willing to make one. And we'll explore that when we talk about bias. So how did these myths start? It all began with the bias of the detectives that led them to act on the belief that Daniel was guilty. The lead detective in the case, Kim Davis, made it clear that her personal feelings led her through the investigation, rather than the facts and evidence. In talking about Janie Liggins, the original accuser of Daniel, Detective Davis told Michelle Malkin, "After I talked to Janie, I was like, something happened to Janie. Her demeanor, hysterical at times, bawling at times. She had no motive at all to make this up." So when she went into her interview with Daniel, she had already made her mind up. She also said, "Before we started the interview, I felt that what Janie told me was the truth." During the course of her interview, she told Daniel at one point she did not believe him. She later told the media that she believed Daniel was a narcissist based on her single interview, and that Detective Gregory was also with her, according to the Oklahoman, said, "He's a sociopath," before the interrogation was even over. Detective Davis said, "I just thought he was very robotic. If I was accused of something like that, my voice would probably go up 10 octaves, and I'd be like, I didn't do that." There are many problems with this line of thinking. Sex Crimes 101 teaches not to judge the accuracy of someone's statements based on their emotions or your feelings. This is important not just in a case where we worry about a false accuser, but you also don't want to brush off a real victim's claims because she didn't react the way you expected. Humans react to traumatic events in numerous ways. Some victims are hysterical, some angry, embarrassed, or without emotion. Some even laugh when retelling the event. Judging people on their emotions and not evidence then may leave you blind to evidence when you come across it. Like in Janie Liggins' case, where the SANE exam yielded no evidence to support her claims, none of that mattered to Detective Davis, because as she told the Oklahoman, "In my gut, I knew she was telling the truth." 2. I teach a class called Cultural Competence in our in-service. One of the things we point out is that we all look at things through our own set of lenses based on our experiences, cultural upbringing, where we go to church, socioeconomic status, etc. When we try to judge the actions of others based on our lenses, in other words, our perspective, we can attribute false motives or feelings to others. In Daniel's case, the detectives interviewing him thought he was robotic, as they casually used vulgar language and thought his voice should have shot up 10 octaves when he was accused of a crime. Daniel was raised by a Japanese mother. From my experience living in Okinawa for 2 years, I learned that most Japanese people do not flaunt their emotions casually and don't appreciate the in-your-face sexual culture. Daniel was also a patrol officer working in a tough area and was no stranger to complaints, as most hardworking cops are. As I watched this interview, I saw a cop who was telling his side of the story, offering whatever he could to clear things up, not flinching when the detectives lied and told him they had evidence of him doing something wrong. The only way the detectives could have seen otherwise is because they had their minds made up. One of the most bizarre things I've ever seen is during the interview with Daniel, detectives learned that Daniel went home and his girlfriend was in bed. Daniel said he tried to have sex with her, but she was tired and didn't want to. Detective Davis asks if she can call Daniel's girlfriend, and he agrees that she can right away. Detective Davis leaves the interview room and returns some minutes later very upset. She tells Daniel she doesn't believe him because his girlfriend did not corroborate his story. She repeatedly refers to her own preferences and says, as a woman, she would be angry if her husband tried to wake her up for sex. I don't know Daniel's girlfriend, but I'm willing to bet that she, and most other people, are not willing to discuss their sex lives with perfect strangers on the telephone. Detective Davis may love talking about sex in graphic detail, but most folks don't. Somehow, she overlooked that, and it was one more thing to confirm her suspicions that Janie was telling the truth and Daniel was a liar. When I talk to fellow police officers, one of the most egregious things in their eyes is the fact that detectives went fishing for victims. In talking about Daniel's case, I heard a really great quote from another police officer. He said, "We investigate crimes, not people. The evidence takes you to a suspect. When you start with a suspect and try to make evidence fit, it never looks pretty. Evidence doesn't have feelings, nor do facts. Justice is supposed to be blind. There is a reason for that." Daniel's detectives did just the opposite. They believed Daniel was a possible serial rapist and then went door to door, as Detective Davis said, looking for other victims. When one of the women said they were a victim of a police officer, this confirmed the biased thinking of the detectives. It didn't bother Detective Davis that the women described their sexual abuser as black, Mexican, shorter than them, or other key descriptors that were obviously not Daniel Holtzclaw. She just chalked it up to trauma. Though according to the stories, the abusing officers made contact with the victims, got their names, etc. There was no sneak attack, and you'd think the ladies would remember the big Asian guy had Daniel been the officer that assaulted them, if anyone had assaulted them at all. But detectives knew for a fact that Holtzclaw had made contact with them because of the record checks he'd performed, so that's all they needed to know to confirm their biased conclusions. As the pile-up of accusers got higher and higher, Detective Davis got more confident that she was right. When Michelle Malkin questioned why Detective Davis believed the women without any evidence, she said, "When you have one victim, I believed her. But we don't always get things done when you have one victim. But when you have 13, and when the MO is the same and the verbiage is the same, it just becomes a little more believable." Well, the verbiage, MO, physical description of the accused all varied, and to the unbiased mind looking at the facts, this would have shown that Daniel was most likely not the suspect. But to Detective Davis, the number of accusers supporting her beliefs were more persuasive than that evidence stuff. Detectives also did not use photo lineups, a very common tool for having victims or witnesses identify suspects in as much of an unbiased way as possible. A photo lineup is when a victim is shown a series of photographs, one of which is a photo of the person the police believe committed the crime, and the victim tells the officer who she believes is the suspect. She should also say how certain she is, because you want there to be a positive identification to go forward, not a guess. In Daniel's case, detectives would have made a lineup with pictures of Asian males in their mid-20s to early 30s. But why show that lineup to a person who said a black cop assaulted her? You wouldn't. Only one victim, alleged victim, was shown a photo lineup with Daniel's picture in it, and she did not pick him from the lineup. Recent revelations, as seen in the tweet by Daniel's lawyer Kathleen Zellner, show that police and the district attorney's office were afraid to show the alleged victims' photo lineups because they were afraid they would not pick out Daniel. Their bias was obviously towards convicting Daniel rather than determining if he was a criminal or not. If these detectives really believed the women were victims, they should have investigated their claims, not twisted what they said to support their conclusions. So when, for example, Sherry Ellis said the officer who sexually assaulted her was a short black officer, why didn't they show her a photo lineup of Alex Edwards?
a former Oklahoma City police officer who worked in the same division as Daniel and who was convicted of soliciting a prostitute and interfering with an FBI human trafficking investigation. He matched the physical description Ellis stated and engaged in criminal conduct while on duty. The biased thinking of the detectives closed them off to a possible suspect in exchange for the suspect they had already decided was guilty. Last on bias. Detective Davis said that Janie and other accusers had no motivation to lie. That is either incredibly ignorant or totally dishonest. She herself acknowledged that false sexual assault claims against police officers are common. CNN, in the wake of the false hate crime accusation made by actor Jesse Smollett, reviewed reasons why people lie about being victims. Among the top reasons was to gain sympathy or get attention. This was especially true in false sexual assault claims. Many other reasons exist, like creating an alibi, getting back at the police, a way to get out of trouble, or supporting other people you believe to be victims. In 2018, Sharita Dixon Cole was arrested for a DUI, but claimed the Texas state trooper that pulled her over sexually assaulted her and arrested her even though she was not drunk. Activists like Sean King latched onto this and ran with it full steam ahead. The trooper's body camera footage was released and showed every claim she made was a lie. Her lie was likely an alibi to justify her arrest and an attempt for sympathy. Many witnesses in Ferguson, Missouri, who claimed they saw Officer Darren Wilson execute Michael Brown with his hands in the air, giving rise to the hands up don't shoot myth that swept the country, were proven to be liars when forensic evidence was presented. Many of them said they lied to support the person they believed was a victim of the police. Shanice Barksdale was charged with filing a false police report when she claimed that Daniel Holtzclaw sexually assaulted her. Her story was so bad, not even Detective Gregory believed it, and she admitted she was lying to try and support the other victims, as she knew he had been accused by several women at that point. Another motivation is the huge payout cities are willing to make for victims of wrongdoing committed by their employees. It is important to note that of the 13 women who made allegations against Holtzclaw, 12 have high-dollar lawsuits pending against Oklahoma City, even the women of whose charges Daniel was acquitted. So, against the backdrop of the riots in Ferguson and Baltimore, Daniel was charged with several crimes of sexual assault. Daniel's case garnered national attention and supported the narrative of police targeting and abusing blacks. The prosecution, during jury selection, even fed jurors the fear of rioting, asking if potential jurors were familiar with what was going on in Ferguson and elsewhere. Grace Franklin, an activist, organized protests to take place at the courthouse during Daniel's trial. She admitted that the group's intent was to riot if the desired outcome did not go their way. She said, "If he wasn't found guilty, I cannot guarantee that something would not have exploded emotionally. We had a saying that if, okay, it goes bad and we actually riot, and the riot happens, okay, we're not going to do it on our side of town, but they're not going to let us go on the other side of town. So what are we going to do?" So clearly, there was an intent to riot there. She also bragged that the protesters' chants interrupted the trial. She said, "We were so loud, the judge had to say something to the jury about us being out there." Daniel's attorney, Scott Adams, tried to get the trial held in a courtroom that would not be affected by outside influence, but the judge just told the jury to ignore the disruptions. Daniel's public defender, who handled his appeal to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, said that this instruction by the judge to ignore the screams from outside the courthouse was as likely as effective as throwing a skunk in the jury box and telling the jurors not to smell it. Two legal experts, one left-wing and the other right-wing politically, weighed in on the case in a brief to the Court of Criminal Appeals. They called the atmosphere of the court circus-like and compared the efforts of protesters to lynch mobs and said the trial bore more resemblance to Maoist show trials than an American judicial proceeding. After looking at the mob influence, jury intimidation, etc., their conclusion was that Daniel was denied his Sixth Amendment rights to a fair trial. The case was not about facts. As we saw from the detectives, their hunches led them on a biased investigation, and they kept using biased strategies that led them to confirm their suspicions to themselves. The case they created, a white cop, as he was described in the media, targeting black women, fed a hungry media, which in turn inspired an angry and disruptive mob threatening to riot. That and the false testimony by the forensic analyst and outright lies by the assistant district attorney, which distorted the juror's view of the DNA, and the pileup of witnesses and absence of evidence led to Daniel's conviction and sentence of 263 years in prison. The jury didn't stand a chance. As one juror stated, "The fact that there were so many victims saying what they were saying resonated with me, that I don't think they're making this stuff up." And he said, and others agreed, that the DNA evidence is what led the jury to convict. Like Detective Davis said, juries today want DNA because everybody watches CSI. Surely this was not justice. It was a victory for activists who hate cops and attorneys who need outrage to get paid. The media, hungry for a juicy story. A win for the DA's office. But justice lost along the way, along with Daniel and his family. As Daniel's appeal was about to be filed, Elaine Taylor, the crime lab analyst, and coincidentally, Detective Rocky Gregory's mother-in-law, retired. Michelle Malkin and others interested in Daniel's case and the bizarre conviction with no direct forensic evidence, witnesses, video, etc., made open records requests to see Elaine Taylor's emails regarding the Holtzclaw case. Oklahoma City responded that her emails had been deleted after she retired and claimed that this was a standard practice. It may be a standard practice for politicians to destroy evidence, so they may be telling the truth from their perspective. But ethically, as a practice to destroy public records, especially those applicable to an ongoing case, I sincerely question the validity of the claim that they just delete people's emails when they leave. I cannot imagine where this would be considered acceptable anywhere in the public square. After some media outlets pressured the city, about 4,000 emails were recovered, but thousands more are still outstanding. And the city says it will not make them available because they are personnel records. The real reason they may be protecting those records may have to do with the secret hearings that were held in June 2017. During these hearings, prosecutors in Daniel's case met with the judge, the crime lab supervisor, Campbell Reddick, a litigation attorney from Oklahoma City, and a member of the Oklahoma City Police Department Chief's Office. Notice the defense was not present. In an utterly un-American move, the defense was not allowed to attend a hearing where issues in Daniel's case were discussed. The only reason we know who was in attendance was because media members filed open records requests on surveillance cameras in the courthouse. The transcripts were filed under seal, and only several months later was Daniel's team able to find out Elaine Taylor's analysis was discussed. The appeals court judges said that the defense should have been invited to the hearing, but claimed nothing that was said there was harmful to the defense. Shouldn't the defense be the judge of that? This was all months ago, and Daniel is waiting to get another hearing. I have often heard people say that if Daniel were innocent, we would be hearing from the officers who worked with him. There are a few reasons why that is faulty reasoning and a poor excuse not to look at the evidence in Daniel's case. It is doubtful that officers knew the details of the case. They likely heard about the case somewhat through the grapevine and through the media, and only heard the story the detectives told, which is likely what the administrators heard and told as well. Without access to the actual facts of the case, officers working with Daniel would have no idea what the truth was. Also, with a devastating narrative of sexual abuse and allegations of racism, there was an obvious effort by the department and police union to distance themselves from Daniel. As is often the case in politics, people don't want to be associated with a label, and rather than defend the truth or learn the truth to know whether or not to defend it, people abandon the person or group that has been given the disgusting label. This was during the tense time frame of the Baltimore and Ferguson turmoil, and police departments, mayors, district attorneys were trying as hard as possible to look good in the public eye. I know my department has a social media policy which prevents officers from talking critically of our department, the chief, other officers, the mayor, the DA, etc. Even if the Oklahoma City officers had all the info, they still have to be afraid of losing their jobs for speaking out on Daniel's behalf. You lose your job in one department, good luck finding another job when you are known for criticizing your own department publicly. So without any real good options, how are officers supposed to speak out about cases like Daniel's? Well, the Fraternal Order of Police, the union that is supposed to represent the police officers, was missing in action when it came to Daniel's defense. He was a dues-paying member and should have had legal defense, but the FOP bailed on him, leaving him and his family to lose their life savings paying for legal fees. Now that the evidence has been available for years that Daniel was railroaded by his own department, the FOP should be front and center in the fight for justice for Daniel. It should be the voice for officers who want to speak out without losing their jobs. But the FOP is missing, just like any evidence of Daniel's wrongdoing. For anyone in the media that may come across this, thank you for your interest in the case. Hardworking journalists have already made a difference in this case, like Michelle Malkin and Phil Cross from Oklahoma City, and others as they have pressured the courts and the Oklahoma City Police Department into doing the right thing when they wouldn't have done it otherwise, like in the case of Elaine Taylor's deleted emails. Please continue these efforts, pressure the Fraternal Order of Police into taking a stand, and help make sure the truth sees the light. For politicians that may see this, thank you for listening. What happened to Daniel could happen to anyone, and we have to do whatever we can to stop this from happening to anyone else. As politicians, you know how one false allegation can ruin a career, or in Daniel's case, take his freedom. You have the opportunity to right a great wrong. I'm not asking for favoritism because he's a police officer. I'm asking that he gets the just process that every American deserves. No mobs, no pileup of accusers, no misrepresentation of evidence. I ask you to use your authority to hold people accountable to see that Daniel gets a fair trial. I'm confident that when this happens, Daniel will be found innocent. Thank you for watching my police officer's view of Daniel's case, and please visit the sources cited below.